Today's video features a paid partnership with BetterHelp, which is very befitting because this is an issue I'm working on today with my BetterHelp therapist. 3 years in, almost. Coming up to 3 years. Both the dogs have decided to join me. They clearly know this is going to be a bit of a sadder video. I've been hiding a bit of a secret struggle, and it's something which has impacted my work and my PhD and basically my life in every aspect, really. The fundamentals of my personality have basically been thrown into an existential abyss that therapists have been attempting to retrieve for several years now. It's basically that I developed a fear of reading. Which sounds really absurd, saying it out loud, but if you would humour me, please allow me to tell you a bit of a story about it. So it happened around the time I received my PhD offer, which is December 2020 now, and obviously I was utterly elated. I'd spent 3 years of no-buy working towards saving up enough money to fund my entire PhD on minimum wage, and after 6 years of applying and getting rejected, I'd finally received an unconditional offer. And I made it, my decade-long dream was finally coming true. Until PTSD decided to have other plans. I laugh at my own torture, it's great. So basically, I noticed within a few months of the offer, I was struggling to find the motivation to read. And I talked about it with my therapist. And at the time, we put it down to stress and overwhelm, which was true. I was working excessively at the time in my life, and we didn't really focus on the reading part of it. At the time, my lack of reading seemed to be a byproduct of burnout. And the solution, would lie in self-care and cutting down on my work commitments and managing my stress, etc. But then, when I formally started my PhD in September of 2021, anxiety attacks started happening. So whenever I would open a book or I would sit down to read, I began crying a lot, which is really embarrassing to admit, but yeah, I just started crying as I was attempting to read, not even getting to the reading part. Sometimes it was a bit of a gentle weep, other times it was like inconsolable sobbing. And again, this was put down to stress and emotional overwhelm. After all, I just put so much work into saving up for this, the PhD. Years of my life have been building to this moment, so it was natural for me to feel a bit cathartic. But it was happening every time. And soon, after a few months, the crying turned into panic attacks. Whenever I would sit down to read a book, either for pleasure or for my studies, I would feel sick to my stomach. And when I get anxiety attacks, I vomit, and I was basically regularly vomiting whenever I came into contact with a book. I would struggle to breathe and my chest would feel tight. If you've had an anxiety attack, you know the attack. You know the anxiety attack, the agony that you're in, and you just leave the room, and I'd end up with my head in a sink, heaving up my nerves, and I'd break into a cold sweat, until so much so that I just end up going to bed for several hours, just taking a nap to make it go away. After 2 years of consistent anxiety attacks, when I approached books to read them, not even successfully reading them, my body began to become numb to it. And it got to a point that, the vomiting and the crying actually stopped. But that was accomplished not through overcoming the source of the anxieties, but through good old disassociation. It was like every time I sat down to read, I would feel like resentful disinterest. I was unable to engage with the words on the page in any emotional way, lest I start crying, really. And this didn't just occur for just a few months, it's been my reality for coming up to 3 years, really. And losing reading has felt like losing part of my soul. To say that I've not felt myself these past few years would be an understatement. The one thing I loved the most all of these years, the thing that got me through horrific, life-threatening illnesses and circumstances in my 20s, was suddenly inaccessible to me. And I honestly just wanted to give up, So a year ago, my therapist and I began discussing the very real possibility that I developed a phobia of reading due to extensive trauma associated with reading. And since then, my therapists, I've had 2 now, and I have developed a theory. And I've been on somewhat of a journey to uncover the legitimacy of this theory. So first we started out by finding out the facts. We both had a sneaking suspicion that almost all of my trauma experienced in childhood could be related to something which we both suspected but didn't formally have a diagnosis for. So I went ahead and bit the bullet, and we were right. Later that year, at the age of 31, which was just last year, I was finally formally diagnosed with dyslexia, and quite bad dyslexia at that. So the only reason I actually ever suspected, or rather I learned that I may have dyslexia, was due to a comment made by my master's dissertation supervisor back in 2015. So again, I was 22, 23 years old. And he asked me if I was getting any help for my dyslexia, which, confused me. I was like, I'm not dyslexic. And he replied, well, basically very gently, kind of like not wanting to diagnose me, but saying with all due respect, I've been in this business for a long time. And from my experience with dyslexic people, you are dyslexic, which was new to me. But then when I discussed it with my peers, turns out everyone knew or thought I was dyslexic and thought I knew I was dyslexic. Like, there was one chap in my group who was just so lovely, and it was the reason that he'd offered to always proofread my essays before I handed them in. Like, he proofread 2 of them in December, like back to back before the hand-in of the year before, because he knew I was dyslexic, and he was offering to proofread them for free and just edit them down and spell check them. And he just thought I never talked about it because I was embarrassed. not that I didn't know. Like, he'd seen the way I had texted him and written things. He was like, I'll proofread that for you, which is incredibly kind of him. And the idea that someone just did that off the bat and didn't mention dyslexia because they thought I was embarrassed, it shows how sweet that person was, genuinely. But also, it was weird knowing that other people can come to the conclusion that I was dyslexic before I'd even ever thought about the potential that I could be dyslexic. I never, ever had been told that before. And it was weird working with my therapist to identify how much my abuse that I had been subjected to in childhood had likely stemmed from undiagnosed dyslexia. And that's too detailed to go into extensive detail in here. I will talk a video about my dyslexic diagnosis and that kind of dynamic, because it brings up a lot of memories. But suddenly it all made sense. And I'm not saying anyone ever deserves to be abused in childhood, obviously, but to know that it could have all potentially been avoided had people known I was dyslexic was pretty devastating. And the news of my official diagnosis started a grieving process that I never knew I really had to undertake. And of course, this wasn't the only reading trauma I was dealing with. There was another element in the room, my return to academia. And anyone who may have watched my channel during my undergraduate and master's days will know that I struggled with very extreme anorexia throughout both of my degrees. And there's a possibility that I have associated books and reading and studying with my eating disorder, which is only further fueling my reading phobia. Now, before I get any more into how I'm dealing with my phobia of reading, obviously I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which is BetterHelp. And, every time I've referenced my therapist in this video, they've been the therapists I've had through BetterHelp. I've been using BetterHelp it'll be March next year. I'll be using it for 3 years. I genuinely credit BetterHelp for actually giving me access to support at my lowest of times. Starting my PhD and then also dealing with the fallout of a breakup after lockdown and working through decades worth of trauma, I've never actually had the opportunity to talk to anyone about it. And that's because BetterHelp's mission has been to make therapy accessible by making it really easy to find a therapist. And you don't have to search for hours of the internet or even travel to get support. It's entirely online and remote, and you can be matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a few days after filling out a questionnaire. Like, I got mine the same day each time. And they matched me based on my needs and the type of therapist you'd like. So it could be that you want to talk about LGBTQIA issues, or it could be that you want to talk with Christian issues, whatever it is. There is someone that could be matched for you. And it's like dating. You can always find a new therapist at no extra cost. You can change therapists when needed, or adjust for I want to talk about trauma, or I want to talk about whatever you need to talk about, you can adjust at no extra cost. So whether you suffer from depression and anxiety, or just going through a really difficult stage in your life, particularly at the Christmas period right now, then therapy can give you the tools that you need to approach life in a different way. And it's super easy to sign up and get matched. There's a link in my description box. It's betterhelp.com/Cinzia. And clicking that link helps support this channel, but also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. So, my dyslexia and its associated trauma and my history of anorexia seem to have created a perfect breeding ground for a bookworm-eating predator, which has been a challenge for both myself and my therapist to find a way around it. It's not as simple as following the advice one would give for getting out of a reading slump, which is reread your beloved classics, or join a book club, or read a shorter book, or read one that you love, etc. Overcoming my reading phobia, which I'm still very much in the depths of, I should add, is a pretty complex process of unstitching the backing of a tapestry of narratives, which I continue to weave for myself decades after my abusers set the stories in place. I'm too slow. I'm thick. I'm so thick, I can't understand this. I can't read those words, so I have to reread them. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I can't remember what that paragraph just said, so I'll have to reread it. And everyone will laugh at me. People will make jokes about me. People will call me a bad reader. They'll say I'm not a real reader. And I remember all the times I was screamed at for not reading fast enough, and all the times things were thrown at me because I spelled a word wrong, and all the times people mocked me for how I mispronounced words, and all the times kids at school laughed at me because my reading level was the lowest in the class. And my family was always so disappointed in me because I wasn't an intellectual and had no natural curiosity. Intellectual children love books, they love reading. You don't, you have no curiosity, you have no intellect. And they told me I didn't have a future in academia. So did my teachers, actually. And I was just such a disappointment. And even today, I'm still a disappointment. And people still mock me for my mispronunciation when I'm reading, particularly reading scripts. People still get angry at me for mispronouncing things. They get angry in the comments. They're insulted, personally offended that I said something wrong. And people still call me thick. People still, even those closer to me, tease me for reading slowly. People mock me for loving books but not reading them enough. People call me a fake reader all the time. And yet all I do every day is read. I read academic articles and blogs and journals. I read chapters of books. I read reviews of books and essays and journals. But I'm much quieter about what I read now for fear of being judged. I don't talk about books because it's pretty painful, in all honesty. I don't talk about my love of books for fear someone will mock me for not reading enough, or reading the same amount as someone else, or reading fast enough. What's sad is I really miss talking about books. I miss the days when they didn't make me vomit or cry or cause shooting pains in my chest or cause my throat to close up. I really miss selling books and reviewing books and designing book covers for the ones that I love the most. But most of all, I miss books. The things that were there for me when I didn't have any friends, when I was waiting in hospital rooms or lying on hospital beds. The things that were there for me when I moved to a new city all alone, or when I failed my first PhD application, or when I was starving and struggling to survive, or when I was unemployed, struggling to pay rent and living on the dole, or when I couldn't afford to turn the heating on and was wrapped up in literally a frost-covered bed. Books were there for me when I was ill, and when I was struggling, and when I was dying, and when I was lonely, and when I was being bullied, and when I was isolated, and when I was breaking down from the inside out. And they never left me. They just sat here waiting for me to heal. And they don't care that I'm slow, or that I struggle to read some of the words. They don't judge me for not being smart enough to understand them, and having to reread pages over and over again, even in simple novels. They don't care that I lack the imagination to see pictures that they paint for me. They don't care that I'm not the best reader, the biggest blogger. They don't care about any of that superficial stuff. They just want me to be a reader again. So I suppose it's time I stopped listening to the people and put my faith back in books again. After all, books save lives. So I better get reading.